October 1066. England was a kingdom on the edge of collapse. The death of King Edward the Confessor had left a vacuum, and with it, a cascade of claims and ambitions. Harold Godwinson, a seasoned Earl of Wessex, had moved quickly to secure the crown, but his claim was contested. Across the English Channel, William, Duke of Normandy, a man of methodical cunning and ruthless reputation, had long asserted that Edward had promised him the throne. And yet, the kingdom itself was not merely a prize. It was a living, breathing entity, vulnerable to the slow erosion of divided loyalties, regional feuds, and the sheer exhaustion of its defenders. The political landscape of 11th century England was not a monolith. It was fractured along lines of personal allegiance and ancient enmity. The northern earls bore grudges against the Godwinsons. Mercenary bands drifted between lords like currents in a river, their loyalty bound more to pay than principle. The very soil of the country seemed to bear witness to decades of localized power struggles, where the death of a lord could leave a shire exposed to raiders, or worse, foreign ambitions. In this atmosphere, Harold's swift coronation was as much a necessity as it was a statement of authority. But authority alone could not hold a realm under the shadow of simultaneous threats. News arrived that would test his mettle immediately. To the north, Harold Hardrada, King of Norway, sailed with a formidable fleet, intent on pressing his claim. Harold was forced to march his forces across hundreds of miles of rugged terrain, from London to the north, in a relentless campaign of rapid movement. Men who had spent their lives defending their own villages now carried the weight of the entire kingdom on their shoulders. Each step northward demanded endurance. Every march tested loyalty. By the time Harold's army met Hardrada at Stamford Bridge, they were disciplined, battle-hardened, yet weary, an army tempered by necessity and the psychological strain of relentless expectation. Meanwhile, across the Channel, William's preparations had been methodical. Normandy's ports had seen an extraordinary mobilization of ships, horses, and supplies. This was no mere raid. It was a calculated invasion, a projection of force built upon decades of Norman military culture. Cavalry, archers, infantry, each had been trained, drilled, and organized to function as a single, responsive organism. William's experience in continental warfare had taught him that speed, flexibility, and the integration of combined arms could offset numerical disadvantages, and he intended to prove it. Every horse was conditioned, every soldier briefed, and every contingency anticipated. The meticulous care and preparation was a reflection of William himself, strategic, patient, and unflinching in the face of uncertainty. Harold's forces, though victorious against Hardrada, paid a price in fatigue and attrition. His men had been pushed to their limits, moving from battle to battle with scarcely a moment to recover. Their arms were worn, their shields dented and chipped, their morale tested by the brutal reality of constant combat. And yet, their return southward was not merely a retreat. It was a race against time. Intelligence from scouts and messengers confirmed that William had landed in Sussex, near Pevensey. The Norman fleet had come ashore unopposed, their horses riding the sand with the momentum of a carefully calculated strike. The strategic stakes were clear. Harold faced a choice defined by both geography and psychology. To consolidate in the south would risk allowing the Normans to entrench and consolidate their beachhead. To advance immediately would mean confronting a fresh enemy with troops already exhausted by months of continuous campaigning. Every decision carried consequences that could not be undone. And yet Harold moved. His men, long trained in the shield wall and defensive formations that had dominated English warfare for decades, understood the principle of rigid cohesion in battle. They were to hold, to withstand, to absorb shock. William, on the other hand, had opportunities that only a prepared and mobile army could exploit. The landing site at Pevensey provided a defensive advantage initially. The marshes and dunes acted as natural barriers. But his vision extended beyond mere fortification. He intended to draw Harold into battle under conditions favorable to cavalry, to exploit mobility against static formations. His intelligence network had identified the routes Harold might take, the supply lines he might rely upon, and the psychological state of men who had marched from one end of the kingdom to the other. This was not speculation. It was a calculus of a general who understood both his forces and his enemy. As the two forces closed in on the terrain near Hastings, the natural landscape itself became a player in the unfolding drama. Rolling hills, ridges, and patches of woodland shaped the lines of march and dictated the angles of engagement. From elevated positions, scouts could see the movement of entire units, and the wind carried the distant sound of hooves and the occasional cry of sentries. Every step taken by Harold's exhausted army was shadowed by the knowledge that they would soon face a cavalry force far more numerous and better rested than any they had encountered for months. Psychological pressure mounted incrementally, manifesting in the tense silences between marches, the hushed consultations of commanders, and the careful rationing of water and provisions. In this calm before the storm, leadership decisions became the defining factor. Harold's judgment would rely on the cohesion and morale of his men, on the discipline honed through previous battles. He knew that his infantry, arrayed in their formidable shield wall, could repel charges under ideal conditions. Yet he also understood that repeated engagements, fatigue, and environmental factors could erode their effectiveness. William, conversely, relied on a combination of faith and calculation. Faith in the training and coordination of his men, calculation in the timing, terrain, and use of mounted units. In the minds of both commanders, the battlefield was as much a psychological theater as a physical one. The human element, too, was ever present. Soldiers and horses alike carried the weight of anticipation. For the infantry, months of campaigning had sharpened their instincts, but also worn them down. Fatigue manifested in hesitation, in uneven lines, in moments when discipline had to be reinforced through shouting and physical prodding. Cavalry, in contrast, benefited from mobility, rest, and the psychological advantage of height and speed. Horses could charge, scatter, and intimidate. Their riders carried not just weapons, but the embodiment of dynamic threat. Here, the stage was set, a contrast between static defense and fluid offense, between the weary and the prepared, between the tested and the methodical. And so, as the sun rose over the hills of Sussex, the two forces approached one another, each step measured, each movement scrutinized. William's army, though smaller in number, exuded confidence shaped by preparation and organization. Harold's men, larger but exhausted, held their formation with the knowledge that the survival of the kingdom rested upon their discipline. Here, in the quiet tension before engagement, the first echoes of what would become a pivotal battle in European history began to resonate, not as a thunder of sword and arrows, but as a subtle interplay of strategy, preparation, and the human capacity to endure under extreme pressure. The stage was set. England teetered on a knife edge, and in the minds of the commanders and soldiers alike, the coming hours would define not only the fate of armies, but the future of an entire kingdom. The morning of October 14th, 1066, dawned cool and gray over the rolling hills near Hastings. Mist lingered in the valleys, clinging to hedgerows and low scrub, softening the contours of the terrain, but leaving no shelter for the men below. Harold's army, numbering perhaps 50,000, formed an imposing mass of infantry, drawn largely from the FYRD, local levies raised from shires across southern and central England, and the housecarls, professional retainers hardened by years of continuous service. Their shields formed a familiar, interlocking pattern that had repelled raiders for decades. Each man bore the weight of expectation and armor alike, their wooden shields thick with iron rims, their axes and swords polished for battle, yet their minds heavy with fatigue from weeks of forced marches. The English shield wall was not merely a physical construct. It was a psychological anchor. Men trusted in its solidity, in the unyielding line of comrades beside them. Yet here on the Sussex ridges, its effectiveness would be tested against a force unlike any they had previously faced, disciplined, mounted, and coordinated in ways the Anglo-Saxons had rarely encountered. William's army was smaller in number, around 5,000, but was trained to operate as a single organism. Norman cavalry, heavily armored knights on horses conditioned for charge and maneuver, were supported by infantry armed with spears and axes, and by archers capable of softening enemy lines before the first impact. Each unit had drilled in coordination, practicing combined attacks that relied on timing, rhythm, and exploitation of gaps in opposing lines. The battlefield itself shaped the engagement even before the first blow was struck. A gentle ridge ran across the center of the field, giving Harold's men a modest defensive height. Behind them, Woods and hedgerows could conceal reserves or slow flanking movements, while the slope ahead allowed William's cavalry to gain momentum during the initial charge. Yet the ridges also limited visibility. From a distance, neither side could fully see the disposition of the other. Scouts moved cautiously, reporting every minor detail: the angle of the Norman approach, the spacing of infantry, the placement of cavalry reserves. These observations would feed into split-second decisions that could determine victory or annihilation. Leadership on both sides was starkly contrasted in style and execution. Harold stood among his housecarls, his posture calm, voice measured. He understood the strength of his men, steady, disciplined, capable of absorbing shock. Yet he also understood their limitations. Fatigue, hunger, and the lingering effects of months of campaigning made hesitation dangerous. Orders were issued sparingly, relying on pre-established formations and signals. Every man knew his place, and every man trusted the shield wall to hold. William, in contrast, was everywhere at once. Mounted on a sturdy destrier, he observed the English lines with careful scrutiny. Flags marked company positions, riders relayed instructions, and archers began to take up their positions on the flanks. William's leadership was not authoritarian in the moment-to-moment sense. It was anticipatory, proactive, shaping the battlefield before engagement rather than merely reacting to it. He understood that the psychological impact of cavalry, speed, height, mass, could unbalance even the most disciplined infantry if applied methodically and in coordination with other elements of his force. The initial engagement unfolded with a measured intensity. Norman archers loosed volleys from a distance, not with the intention of annihilation, but of disruption. English shields absorbed many arrows, yet the repeated impacts tested endurance. The sound was subtle at first, the twang of bowstrings, the dull thud of arrows striking wood, but it grew into a constant percussion, an almost hypnotic pressure that seeped into the consciousness of soldiers. Even trained housecarls could feel the cumulative effect. Hesitation, the smallest widening of lines, the momentary flicker of doubt that could be fatal in the shield wall. Cavalry began to probe the edges. Norman knights rode in disciplined pairs and small groups, testing the resilience of the English flanks. Horses thundered, their hooves striking the earth with explosive force. Men in the shield wall responded, planting their feet, tightening grips on axes, bracing for impact. Each collision between cavalry and infantry was a microcosm of the larger battle, a test of discipline, endurance, and psychological resilience. For the English, these were moments of terror framed by training. The weight of steel and the shock of mounted assault threatening to splinter even the most steadfast formation. Tactical decisions became matters of survival. William exploited feigned retreats, a strategy that had been refined over years of continental warfare. Cavalry would advance, draw back, and then circle to strike at gaps in the line created by pursuing infantry. For the Anglo-Saxons, who had rarely seen coordinated withdrawals executed with such precision, these movements were disorienting. Men who had been taught to advance steadily against advancing foes were confronted with the illusion of Norman flight, tempting them to break formation in pursuit. Every moment of hesitation, every misstep, risked the collapse of cohesion that held the wall together. Psychologically, the battlefield was a pressure cooker. English soldiers, already fatigued, struggled to maintain focus as attacks repeated, volley after volley, charge after charge. The rhythm of combat was relentless, punctuated by the cries of the wounded, the clanging of armor, and the neighing of horses. Norman knights, in contrast, operated in cycles of rest and action. Their cavalry could charge, withdraw, and regroup with minimal delay, exploiting the differences in endurance and morale. William's men were trained to sustain this pressure, to recognize patterns in the enemy's responses, and to escalate impact to the moment of maximum effect. By midday, the dynamic of the battlefield had begun to shift subtly but decisively. English lines remained largely intact, yet the strain of repeated cavalry charges, combined with archery harassment and psychological manipulation, began to show. Gaps formed at the edges, small but critical openings that could be expanded. Leaders within the Norman army observed these fissures, sending additional units to exploit them. Communication across the battlefield, flags, mounted messengers, and prearranged signals, allowed William to coordinate attacks with precision that the English tied to the rigid shield wall, struggled to match. The terrain further amplified the effect. The higher ground held by Harold's men offered defense, but limited flexibility. Maneuvering cavalry found ways to use slopes to their advantage, building speed for impact while minimizing exposure to counterattack. Archers took positions on rising ground where they could target the gaps created by advancing knights, their arrows reinforcing the psychological pressure on the English ranks. The battlefield became a complex interplay of physical and mental strain. Weight, height, speed, fatigue, and perception all converged to test each soldier's resolve. At the same time, the human dimension was increasingly evident. Soldiers reacted not as abstract units, but as individuals confronting fear, uncertainty, and the instinct for survival. Hesitation or misjudgment could propagate through the line, compounding the strain on adjacent men. Leaders shouted encouragement, reordered units, and reinforced weak points, yet the cycle of engagement and pressure was unrelenting. This was not the chaos of legend. It was a structured, incremental erosion of defense under calculated, applied force. By late afternoon, initial probes and volleys had evolved into more sustained clashes. Cavalry charges struck with growing effectiveness, exploiting the slight disorder creeping into the English lines. Archers intensified fire from advantageous positions, creating pockets of disorientation. Norman infantry advanced into these gaps, reinforcing pressure and forcing the English to redistribute forces under threat. Every movement was measured, deliberate, and coordinated, a stark contrast to the reactive endurance of Harold's army. It was a battle defined by attrition, coordination, and psychological pressure as much as by the clashing of steel. Each side sought to understand the other, to test resilience, to find a moment when hesitation or fatigue could be exploited. For William, that moment would come not through sheer force, but through the accumulation of pressure, the orchestration of timing, and the exploitation of human frailty at the precise point of maximum effect. As the afternoon sun began to dip toward the western horizon, the tide of the battle subtly shifted. The English shield wall, though still formidable in appearance, was showing the first signs of stress. Hours of repeated cavalry charges, coupled with sustained archery and the subtle manipulations of Norman feigned retreats, had introduced fissures in the once impenetrable formation. Fatigue had begun to manifest in tiny but critical ways. A soldier leaning too heavily on his shield, a gap forming between two men as a thrusting knight pressed a line, a fleeting moment of hesitation as an arrow struck home. These small disruptions, almost imperceptible individually, began to accumulate, creating a vulnerability that William's experienced eye immediately identified. William himself remained calm, surveying the battlefield from horseback. Unlike his opponents, he had reserves, mobility, and flexibility. His cavalry could exploit openings with speed, and his archers could deliver targeted harassment to compound confusion. More importantly, William understood human psychology. He recognized the pressures weighing on Harold's men, the weight of prolonged engagement, the slow erosion of confidence, and the creeping awareness that retreat was no longer an option. By sustaining this pressure, he forced decisions upon the English soldiers, decisions that were no longer purely tactical but existential, born of instinct and fear. The turning point arrived not with a sudden, overwhelming strike, but as a calculated culmination of incremental advantages. Norman cavalry, feigning a disorderly withdrawal, drew portions of the English fyrd from the shield wall. Some men, driven by instinct, broke formation in pursuit, stepping into open ground where they were vulnerable to counterattack. The moment these lines thinned, Norman knights wheeled around and struck with brutal efficiency. Horses collided with shields, axes and swords found gaps, and men who had relied on cohesion suddenly faced concentrated force on multiple sides. In this way, the static advantage of the shield wall was neutralized, transformed into a liability when its discipline was fractured. Harold himself fought at the center of the line, his presence a focal point for both morale and command. Chroniclers emphasized his valor, but even leadership could not indefinitely compensate for structural collapse. As the shield wall began to buckle at key points, communication became strained. Orders that might have redistributed forces or reinforced weak points arrived too late, or were misinterpreted into chaos. The English army, once a unified mass of disciplined infantry, began to segment into pockets isolated and exposed. Psychological strain multiplied. Fear spread silently, not as panic in conventional sense, but as caution, hesitation, and the loss of confidence in the integrity of the line. Cavalry, exploiting the fractures, pressed relentlessly. The combination of speed, mass, and coordination amplified the impact. Horses, armored and trained for shock, drove into gaps, scattering isolated groups of infantry and cutting off retreat. Archers targeted clusters of men trapped between mounted columns, ensuring that any attempt to regroup was met with persistent pressure. William's forces operated as a network of interdependent units, each reinforcing the other, each responding to changes in real time. The English men, conversely, were bound by rigid formation and exhaustion, unable to match the fluidity of their opponent. The death of Harold, a pivotal psychological and symbolic blow, crystallized the collapse. According to contemporary sources, he was struck in the eye, though the exact circumstances remain debated. Regardless, the loss of their king was immediate and devastating for the English soldiers. Command and morale, already stretched thin, crumbled. What had remained a tenuous equilibrium of fatigue, pressure, and strategic skill dissolved into disorganization. Soldiers retreated into small groups, attempting to hold ground individually, while Norman forces systematically encircled and neutralized resistance. By evening, the battlefield was effectively under Norman control. Pockets of resistance lingered. Housecarls fought valiantly to cover retreating feigned, and small-scale skirmishes persisted. Yet the overall structure of the English army was destroyed. William's calculated application of combined arms, timing, and psychological manipulation had converted numerical inferiority into decisive advantage. The key factors were clear: sustained pressure, exploitation of human frailty under stress, and the flexible, mobile coordination of cavalry and supporting units. The victory was not a stroke of luck, but the outcome of deliberate planning executed with precision and patience. The aftermath reshaped the kingdom irreversibly. England, previously a patchwork of competing earldoms and semi-autonomous shires, now faced the imposition of Norman authority. Castles were built to secure key strategic locations, administrative structures were centralized, and a new aristocracy gradually replaced the old. William's success at Hastings was not merely military. It was a demonstration of strategic foresight and organizational superiority, highlighting the effectiveness of integrated, mobile forces over static mass, and of psychological acumen over sheer numerical strength. The human cost was immense. Contemporary estimates suggest that tens of thousands of English soldiers and levies were killed or incapacitated. Survivors faced not only the devastation of the battlefield, but the broader consequences of occupation, displacement, and loss of property. Norman casualties, while significantly lower, reflected the intensity of engagement and the hazards inherent in mounted assault against disciplined infantry. Yet for William, each loss was measured against a long-term objective: securing the throne, consolidating power, and reshaping the political landscape of England in accordance with his vision. Historians often emphasize the symbolic weight of Hastings, the clash of Anglo-Saxon infantry against Norman cavalry, the end of one era and the beginning of another. Yet, beneath symbolism lies a lesson in military psychology and operational art. The battle illustrates how endurance, discipline, and numerical superiority can be overwhelmed by mobility, coordination, and sustained pressure. It demonstrates the importance of flexibility in command, the exploitation of terrain and human behavior, and the cumulative effect of attrition on morale and cohesion. Above all, it is a testament to the fact that decisive victory often arises not from a single heroic act, but from the relentless, patient application of strategy, pressure, and opportunity over time. By nightfall, Hastings was a field of silence, broken only by the distant groans of the wounded and the measured movements of Norman troops securing the ground. The English army, once the backbone of the kingdom's defense, had been shattered. William, now unchallenged, prepared to consolidate his position, aware that securing victory required more than winning the field. It demanded organization, foresight, and the integration of conquest into governance. The conquest of England was underway, but it was the events of this single day, the deliberate erosion of discipline, the exploitation of fatigue, and the methodical collapse of the shield wall, that ensured William's triumph was both absolute and enduring. Hastings 1066 remains a study in contrasts, between endurance and mobility, between numbers and coordination, between static defense and calculated offense. It was a battle where human psychology, battlefield strategy, and leadership intersected with devastating clarity. And while centuries have passed, the lessons of that day about preparation, pressure, and the decisive value of flexibility remain instructive, a quiet reminder of how carefully applied force can reshape the fate of nations